In this episode of CA Please, we're going to be taking a look at the different generals options available for all the factions. I'm not going to be talking about the Longbeard factions that came with the Longbeard DLC, because these factions are getting looked at. One thing that many factions have in common is the Germanic noble level general. And if we look at the stats of the Germanic noble, 14, 40, 14, 29, if we compare that to the general of the Nordic warlord, 14, 40, 14, 19, 57, so more armor. But still, these are terrible units with lower melee attack than, significantly lower than levy troops. Makes absolutely no sense. During the era, this is going to be both a historical argument. I don't particularly like historical arguments regarding game balance, but some things make so little sense that in order for them to not be immersion breaking, they need to be changed, and this is one of those things. So in the era where Attila the Hun is rampaging around the fall of the Western Roman Empire and such, something that most generals, commanders, kings, earls, whatever they may be, would have in common is that they would gather around them their best troops. They would have them as bodyguards, or hird, or huskarlar. Those names wouldn't exist by then, by the way, but they would gather their most important warriors around them. And this makes sense because generals and kings fought on the battlefield, and if the general, king, and his companions were slain, that would often result in the loss of very important members to society. And these were the best equipped men, often men who had war and soldiering as their prime occupation, while these levy, like the Germanic levies, these are basically guys and gals that would be working on their farms most of the year, hunting, and then they would get called in to defend or to go on a campaign. That these units are more combat able than the most elite soldiers, the chosen soldiers of the king, makes absolutely no sense. It's a horrible design decision, and in my opinion, the general for all the factions should be consisting of the most elite troops available to that faction, the most capable troops available to that faction. So in the case of the Alans, we have the Alani general, which is a very good shock cavalry general. However, he does not have a comparable infantry general. He just has the boring, terrible Germanic nobles. If we look at the Danes, we have the same problem with the Nordic warlord being in a unit that has less melee capabilities than the hirdmen, and essentially the chosen warriors of the king are now worse than the standard hirdmen, the standard soldiers. I don't quite know how that works logically or even in terms of game balance, because that means that when you are fighting as the Nordic factions and you have this warlord general, you probably want to keep your general a fair bit away from the fighting, because he has a very low melee attack, very low melee defense. And while his armor and health are great, he is not good. He doesn't know how to swing his sword. And we have the same problem here. The Nordic levy has the exact same melee attack as the Germanic levy. There's so much copy-paste in these rosters that it makes me... It's just annoying to see how lazy the unit design has been. There are some cool units, but there's also a lot of lazy unit design. The same goes for the Nordic raid leader. He has picked his chosen men, and the melee attack of the Nordic axe warriors is 3 times higher than the melee attack of the Nordic raid leader. It's just mind-boggling how that works. Now, the Viking captain is a bit of a special case, but the Viking captain, if we compare him to the cheapest single-handed axe, the Nordic Axe Warband, the Nordic Axe Warband still higher melee attack than the Viking captain, and the Viking captain has lost some of the armor he had as a Nordic warlord. So this goes for all of the Nordic factions. The same for the Eastern Romans. These units are so similar in melee attack, melee damage, and the charge of the Palatina guards are worse. They have good armor and more melee defense than the Nordics, but it's just these two are useless. But then the cavalry generals are two very capable generals. They are actually pretty good for the Eastern Roman Empire. For the Franks, we have the same problem. We have a good cavalry general, but instead of having the option to have, for example, elite sword hairband, royal anstrutiones, or even a Francesca general, we have the same vanilla Germanic nobles as everyone else. It's lazy, it's boring, and it breaks immersion in the game. For the Huns, the general's options are actually quite decent. The steppe chieftain is the best melee cavalry unit for the Huns in terms of cost efficiency, and that is alright. I think the general's options are alright for the Huns, but the Hunnic warlord is much too expensive. We've covered the Jutes. The Langobards are going to be looked at in patch 2, so I'm going to be ignoring them for the time being. The Goths have good cavalry generals, but they have a terrible Germanic noble general, and he has the same problem as all of the other generals. He needs to pick his fighters better. I mean, if you look at the melee attack for the Gothic warband, just the dirt cheap Gothic warband, 57 melee attack, and then comes the general swinging at 14 melee attack. Just not a very good design decision. For the Sassanid Empire, we have some decent cavalry options, so they are off the hook for now. For the Saxons, we have the same problem as the other Nordics. The Nordic raid leader does not know how to swing his axe. The Nordic warlord does not know how to swing his sword. The chieftain with Gedrith, he does not know how to swing his sword very well either, compared to a unit like the Nordic warriors, for example. And let's see, for the Vandals, again, the Germanic nobles. And when we have the noble Suebi swords, why would you go into battle followed by Germanic nobles instead? For the Visigoths, we have the same, a good cavalry general, Germanic noble general that does not know how to fight. And for the Western Roman Empire, the exact same thing as the Eastern Roman Empire. The Palatina guards are terrible in combat. They have decent armor, decent health, but the main theme, when you look at all of these rosters, when you look at all of them at once, it becomes apparent that for the general's options, you have the copy-paste Germanic nobles, and the trend with the price and the stats and the abilities of the Germanic nobles of all of these factions, the Nordic warlord, the Roman generals, they are so similar, and they are boring as hell. So, in my opinion, the CA please moment here is going to be that the generals of all of these factions are going to have a cavalry. Not all factions are going to have a cavalry general, but the ones that do have a cavalry general, they're going to have a solid cavalry unit to escort them into battle, and they are going to be picking from their best units when they pick a bodyguard for the general. So in the case of the stats are increased. So for example, for the Danes, the Nordic warlord should at least have the stats of elite Nordic warriors or Nordic warriors, at the very minimum of Hirdman. And the same for the Germanic nobles. Sure, give them more armor than the noble Germanic swords, but also give them at least their melee stats, because it's embarrassing to see generals running around with their most elite soldiers, their retinues, their bodyguards, their hirdmen, and they have less practice with their swords than the Germanic levies have with their spears. Horrible stuff. CA, please. Strength and honor.